But the book of Job presents us with a question of how do we deal when bad things happen? When tragedy strikes, when difficulties come our way, how do we deal with that? How do we process it? Because in chapters 1 and 2, we find that Job is the wealthiest man in the world, but yet God allows the examiner or Satan to test him. And he loses all of his wealth. All of his 10 kids die. His wife forsakes him. He has boils. He is wasting away. He is an inch away from death. And we're confronted with the problem, what does Job do about it? Because Job doesn't know that God allowed the examiner to test him. He doesn't know that. He just knows that bad things are happening. And so we find that he has 3 friends, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad, come and they meet with him. And chapters 3 through 31 are back and forth between these 4 guys, Job and his 3 friends. So last week we looked at Job and Eliphaz, and this week we're going to look at the first interaction that Job has with Bildad and Zophar. But Job confronts us with the question, what do we do when bad things happen? James chapter 1 tells us we're to rejoice when we endure challenges and trials. But what that has done is it made it so we just pretend like everything's okay, which is unhealthy and it's not legitimate. So Job teaches us, how do we enter the depths of our difficulty? How do we sit in it? How do we take time to sit in the difficult, to process and allow God to speak to us, to move in us? But today, we're going to look at this concept of false platitudes or foolish platitudes. And we have those. We have those as people. We can use the word cliche, right? We have cliches when we talk about some, whether it's faith-based things or other things as well. These are surface level statements that we use to help us feel better. And sometimes these cliches have truth. But just because they have truth doesn't mean it's the full truth, which is part of what the foolish platitudes do for us as we look at Job chapter 8 and 11. Because the difficulty Job is facing is more than an intellectual problem. It consumes all that is him. It's more than just a math problem. It's not, well, I lost this money, now what do I do? It's body, mind, spirit, soul. It's everything about Job is suffering and going through this. Our tendency, again, is to speak in cliches or have these surface level platitudes. And it's easy to be overly simplistic when others suffer. When you suffer and I have no emotional connection to what you're specifically going through, it's real easy for me to say, well, God's working all things out. It's real easy for me to say, oh, we'll be okay. You'll get through this. God will see you to the other side. Those are things I can say to you because we're being overly simplistic, but there are no easy answers. And I say that because partial truths are dangerous truths. And if we settle on partial truths, then those things can be manipulated or corrupted very easily. So we come to Job chapter 8, and we find Bildad's first speech. Bildad, we can ironically call him the comforter because some refer to him as the most hurtful one. Of Job's 3 friends, he is not kind or compassionate. And he tells Job that the tragedy that he is enduring is because of punishment for his sin. Well, you sinned, so God has brought this judgment on you. He's very legalistic, but he has several flaws as he comes to Job. And one of those is that he answers without seeking understanding first. We've all been guilty of this. We see the scenario, we think we understand it, and we provide an opinion, an answer, or solution, or something. But then later we find out there are a lot more layers to the situation than we understood. So he's assuming he knows, and he has no empathy for Job because of that. All he sees is Job was rich, tragedies happened, must be because you sinned. That's what he is telling Job. And he even goes so far as to say that Job's kids had sinned, which is why they died. What a dreadful thing to say to somebody. I mean, that's brutal. There is nothing comforting or helpful about that. And another flaw that Bildad has is that he has correct but incomplete theology. And this is an issue all three of the friends struggle with throughout. Bildad claims that God has a plan, which is correct. But then he goes to say that suffering is only the result of sin. So we see he is partially correct, but he's not fully correct, and he has corrupted his conclusions because of that, and which is why partial truths are dangerous truths. If I only have part of it, I can get to conclusions that are unhelpful, unhealthy, and downright dangerous. See, Bildad is speaking out of the wrong spirit. If we're honest with ourselves, incomplete truths are often lies. Really, there's not that much different. If you are called to bring the truth and you withhold information, are you technically lying? Maybe not. Maybe you are. But oftentimes, if I'm withholding something because I don't want to give that information, then I'm essentially lying. If somebody asks me a question, I don't give them all the truth, and I imply that that's everything, but there's more. That seems like a lie to me. You see, Bildad understands that God is just. That's his issue. Well, God is just, and if God is just, and this is happening to Job, there must be some type of reason that we can point to as to why this is happening. Bildad emphasized the justice of God, but neglected God's holiness, his mercy, his love, his grace, his forgiveness. Now, that's real easy for us to see because we are on this side of Jesus. We're on this side of the cross. And all of this is reconciled at the cross. The justice and mercy of God are reconciled at the cross. And we see how beautiful it all is, how God is able to maintain his justice and his integrity while also being gracious and compassionate and merciful and forgiving to us. Bildad didn't have the cross, didn't have Jesus, so we do need to give him at least some type of recognition that we're in a different place than he is. Otherwise, we're no better than he is. We're coming to conclusions without actually seeking understanding. But in chapters 9 and 10, Job replies. And he replies in a myriad of ways, pointing to creation, pointing to his experience. And he makes an argument that God deals with our sin with grace and mercy. But there's a concept that Job desperately desires. And we see this as he continues to talk in the next chapters after this. Job desires vindication. He says, I've done nothing wrong. I've done nothing to deserve this. This tragedy has happened to me for no reason. I want to be vindicated and proven that I am innocent. Now, Job recognizes that he is mortal, that he is very limited. He only has a perspective of such size. He can't see everything. He knows that he doesn't know all things, but yet he can't see how he is guilty. And he recognizes, he says, I want to be vindicated, but how can a mortal prove their righteousness? How could he prove to God that he is righteous? He can't, because God is way up here, Job is way down here. Even though Job has done nothing wrong, he can never elevate himself to God's level. So he's struggling with it. He says, I've done nothing wrong. I want to be vindicated, but I can't do it myself. Now then Job does something that we desperately need to do. As people, we need to do this on a regular basis. He searches his heart to see if there was unconfessed sin in his life. We know how the story begins. God has identified Job as blameless. There's no one else like him. In Job chapter 1 and 2, both chapters, God identifies Job as blameless. So we know that when he's saying, I'm innocent, we're like, yeah, we know. God has identified you as innocent. but there was no one else like him in all the world. So what I want us to be challenged by is we need to be careful to not sit here and think, well, I'm blameless. There may be one of you that's blameless in here, but then everybody else would be on a different level. Job was the one person. That's my point. There can be one exception. We all can't be exceptions. Then that's just how it is. But Job is the exception. He is blameless, but he searched his heart. So even the person who's blameless took time to search his heart. So my challenge for you as we look at Job is to say, do I need to search my heart? The answer is yes. Am I willing to search my heart? That's between you and Jesus. That's what Jesus is calling us to search our heart to see if there's unconfessed sin, if we are not right with God. Now, Job then comes to a radical conclusion. We're still in chapter 9 here. He concludes that even if he's innocent, he still might suffer. This really bothers his friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar can't stand this conclusion because then it means that their life might be in jeopardy. They might be the ones to suffer next. They love the prosperity gospel. If I do what is right, God will bless me. If I do what is wrong, God will curse me. So if I do what is right, all my stuff will be safe. My health will be okay. I'll live a long, prosperous life. That's what they believed. That's what they wanted to be true. But Job is confronting that. He's confronting it knowing that his time is running out, that he's not going to be alive much longer. He has no material possessions. All of that was taken away. All of his kids have been killed. His wife has forsaken him. He is now covered in boils, sitting in ashes, destitute, an inch away from death. So he's asking God, vindicate me because time's running out. I'm not going to be alive for very much longer. Please come to me. Now, to prove his righteousness, Job would need to take God to court. And he asks for some type of advocate or arbitrator. That's what he wanted. And if we translate that Hebrew word into English, we kind of get the idea of that Job was asking for an umpire or a referee. He wanted someone to keep it fair, to know the rules, to say what is right, what is wrong. He needed somebody to call to account what had happened. That's what he is calling out for. That's what he is longing for. He longed for a mediator. Again, we're on this side of Jesus. Jesus is our mediator. He's our advocate who is constantly advocating to the Father on our behalf. We have that. That's a huge blessing that we are able to experience that Job could not. Job was limited by what he was allowed to know. And he was struggling with it. He is not able to understand what God is doing. But you know the great thing is that understanding is not required for obedience. God doesn't call us to understand. He calls us to obey. And sometimes that seems a little difficult. You know, we've been put in positions where someone says, well, just do what I say. As parents, we're really good at telling our kids that. But praise be to God that God is greater than me in a much more significant way than I'm greater than my kids. Right? God is so much higher than me that it doesn't even compare to how much higher I am than my kids. When God says just listen to me, it's a lot different than when I tell somebody else just listen to me. We can trust God. So that's where our faith comes in. We are obedient to him, not because we know everything, not because we have agreed to the plan or approved the plan that God has, but that we trust him. God calls us to trust him even if we don't have the understanding. But Job is not suppressing his difficulty. He's not pretending everything's okay. He is calling out and crying out to God saying, why is this happening? He's saying, you are not treating me like a valued thing you created. If this is how you treat your creation, you do not value creation. Job is looking for meaning as to why he is suffering. And we do the same thing. When I go through difficulties, I try to figure out why I'm going through that. Sometimes it's my fault, sometimes it's somebody else's fault. but I still try to figure out why. But it's really difficult when we can't find any meaning in our suffering. There seems to be no point, no purpose. Like, God, why are you allowing this to happen? And so I think we can find a difference. Like, if somebody wrongs me or somebody does something, and it, whether intentionally or not, and it harms me, even if it's horrifically, I can blame that person. There is an object to my frustration. I can say, how dare that person do this? But if we have something like a child who has a terminal illness, and we're like, why? Nobody did anything wrong. This is just a tragedy of life. And it's really difficult to come to terms with that because there is no object for our frustration except for God, but yet we feel like Job where God's not showing up. Job is calling out to God, where are you? Let me plead my case. Why aren't you showing up? That's what Job is doing. He's begging for an opportunity to be vindicated. He's not pretending it's okay, which is probably our default mode. We're going to pretend it's okay, act like it's no big deal. We're going to suppress those emotions and move on and just act like we're good to go and it's no big deal. Sometimes we face tragedies in life that are overwhelming, where we ask, why would God allow this? What is the purpose of this? Which is what Job is doing. Not in a way that is sinning, not in a way that is indignant towards God, but in a way that's crying out to God and saying, God, help me. Please meet me in this moment. But after Job does that, Zophar begins his first speech. We come to chapter 11. Zophar is the youngest. So they go in age order. Eliphaz is the oldest. He spoke first. Bildad is the middle. He spoke second. And then Zophar is the youngest. He speaks third. And he is arrogant. He is merciless. And he essentially tells Job that you got what you deserved. What a great friend. Now sometimes we get what we deserve and we can point that out to our friends. Right? I mean, if you walk barefoot through thorns, your friend's going to be like, well, you got what you deserved. But remember, Job lost all of his material possessions. The wealthiest man in the world. Lost all of his material possessions. All 10 of his kids were killed. His wife has forsaken him, has left him. He is dying, covered in boils, dying. And Zophar is like, yeah, you got what you deserved. What a terrible friend. That's what's happening in this. And he makes 3 claims about Job. He tells Job that he is guilty of sin, that he is ignorant, and that he is stubborn. Now, he's frustrated with the wordiness and the foolishness and what seems to be the self-righteousness of Job and his friends. So when he says that Job is guilty, he's telling Job that he got what he deserved. Now, when a friend is suffering, they need someone to show them compassion. If I'm suffering and I go to a friend, I'm seeking comfort, I'm seeking someone to listen, not for someone to judge me. Now, there's time for suggestions or opinions, there's times for rebuke, but if we are really quick at moving towards opinions and forgetting about the comfort, about just being there for our friend. Zophar didn't even attempt to be there for Job. He just went to rebuke Job and said, you get what you deserve. You must have sinned, which is why all these things happen. And so the partial truths that Zophar believed had these dangerous conclusions of he was bitter, he was self-righteous, and he was not kind or compassionate to his friends. And he's also contradictory. He claims that Job is beyond redemption, but yet he calls Job to repent in hopes that God will restore him. Well, he's either beyond redemption or he's not. Either he will repent and God will restore him, or he won't. But the advice that the friends gave Job was all out of fear because they didn't want the same things to happen to them. They all said things that were true and even good, but they were foolish. They were narrow. They put God in a box. Their theology was both dead and rigid. there wasn't any life to it. There wasn't anything about it that really explained the full character of God. Their motivation was that they were afraid calamities would fall on them next. And so they needed to justify why Job was suffering because they didn't want to put themselves in jeopardy of being the next person to suffer. That was their fear. So on some level, we can have empathy for the friends because they were afraid. They see Job and they are terrified because they don't want to experience that too. We can judge them, and rightfully so, but we also need to learn from their mistakes so we don't make the same mistakes. Now, I've heard it said that we need to be careful of asking God to tell others what they need unless we are willing to allow God to speak to us. So if I'm going to ask God to tell you what you need to do, then I need to be willing to allow God to speak to me to tell me what I need to do. It's a lot easier for me to tell you to get your act together than for me to seek Jesus and allow him to do the work in my life that I need him to do. It is. It's easier to point fingers at others than it is to take time for Jesus to work in our lives. That's the reality of it. And that's what Job's friends do. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar all do that. Telling Job he's getting what he deserves. There must be some sin in his life because that's why he is suffering to such a horrific degree. But we thank God that's not how it is. That we don't get what we deserve, because if we got what we deserved, then we would deserve eternal punishment and condemnation. But because of Jesus Christ, we know that's not how God works. God is a God of grace, of forgiveness, of kindness, of compassion. He's a God of justice, don't get me wrong. But Jesus made it so we can be right with God. Jesus upholds the character of God so that the punishment for our sin is covered, not by our abilities, not by our strength, not by our efforts, but by the sacrifice of Jesus. That's what Jesus did for us. Again, we're on this side of Jesus. Job and his friends didn't have the same perspective as we do. But we still have the same temptation as Job's friends of trying to pretend like everything's okay. Well, if I do all these things right, then Jesus will bless me. If I do all things right, then I'll get into heaven. That's not how it works. Jesus says, just come to me and let me shape your life. That's what Jesus offers us. So we can think of the difficulties we face in life. We can even think of the good things we face in life. It's not about your ability. It's not about God rewarding you just because you did good things. We can't always explain why good things happen or why bad things happen. But what God does is he invites us to trust him, to say that he knows better than we do. He knows infinitely more than we do, because if we do anything else, then we land on partial truths, and partial truths are dangerous truths that can be corrupted. But it's because of Jesus we can see that all this is reconciled. We are reconciled to God through Jesus, that while we were still sinners, God showed his great love for us by sending Jesus to die for us. That's the hope we cling to as we think about what our suffering is, what our blessings are, and what it means to be in a relationship with God.